We live in a day and age where racism is acceptable. Specifically, racism towards white people is acceptable. On today's episode of Forge and Anvil, we will talk with Jeremy Carl about his new book, Unprotected Class, how anti-white racism is tearing America apart. All this and more, so stick around. Welcome to Forge and Anvil, where we hammer out uncomfortable conversations to sharpen ourselves for the cultural, political, and spiritual war we are living in. My name is Connor. I am host of this podcast. I am a husband, a father, and a follower of Christ Jesus, doing my best to represent him well wherever I can. As I mentioned at the top of the show, I am joined by guest Jeremy Carl, who's written an exciting new book. So, Jeremy, go ahead and say hello to our audience and introduce yourself to those who are not yet familiar with your work.
It's a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on, Connor. Name is Jeremy Carl, as you just touched on. I'm a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute, which is a public policy think tank. We're based out in California, but I actually work out of my home in Montana, and we have a pretty distributed kind of list of fellows at this point all around the country. And prior to this, I worked at the Hoover Institution as a fellow at Stanford University. I was a senior official in the Trump administration and done a number of other sort of things that we can or can't get into later in my professional life as well. But really wrote this book because I really saw it as a pressing problem that was not being addressed, and I felt like we should address it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. Before we get started, those of you listening, feel free to jump on over to forgeandanvil.substack.com. That is our site where you can find everything in one neat place. You can actually sign up at that Substack for free to get content directly to your email. There's articles written by yours truly, as well as updates on the show, as well as the episodes from the show and extra episodes like our In the Van segments where I break down news stories in usually 10 to 15 minute segments. So feel free to check that out. You can also become a paid supporter there for additional content that is for supporters only. So we really appreciate your support. And of course, share this episode far and wide. We will actually be premiering live on YouTube, but this is not actually live. This is pre-recorded, but either way, feel free to blow up the chat if you want. It'll probably help with the algorithm. And of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Forge and A for updates on the show and other antics. So appreciate all that. Now that the laundry list is out of the way, though, Jeremy, let's go ahead and just start from the beginning. So why did you write this book and where did you get the title?
Well, I think perhaps the best way to describe it, especially since this is a Christian show, is to kind of use a little bit of a biblical metaphor here, and without in any way implying a comparison, but it was a little bit like God argues with Moses about how he wants him to lead the Israelites, and Moses keeps making these excuses, and finally God just tells him to shut up and that Aaron can help the fact that he's slow of speech. And that was sort of my take going into this, is I really hoped that somebody else would write this book because it's an important topic. There are other people with really, really big profiles out there who I thought could do this, and it's controversial, so it's not going to receive universal love, although I've been really fortunate to get a lot of kind endorsements from folks like Tucker Carlson and Charlie Kirk and Victor Davis Hanson and Rod Dreher and Chris Rufo and Heather McDonald and a bunch of other folks like that. But this was really a kind of putting on the armor of God experience for me to kind of go into this battle. And I just, I really felt like this was out there and that we needed to be talking about it. And so that's why somebody needed to be talking about it, and nobody was really kind of coming out and saying it directly. And so that's really why I wrote the book.
Awesome. Yeah, and it's got a wonderful title. So Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart. And I'll try to see if at the end of the stream I can pull up the cover, because the cover is beautiful as well. It's really well done. So
and I'm sorry, I should have answered your question about the title. So the title, The Unprotected Class, comes from the concept in civil rights law where we have a thing called protected classes that can range from everything from your disability to your sex to any number of things, but most commonly kind of around race. And theoretically, white people even are protected classes, and it basically keeps you from being discriminated against on that protected characteristic. But in reality, what we found historically, at least, is that whites have been an unprotected class with respect to their race. So everybody else getting these protections and whites are not. And that was really the origin of the title of the book.
Right, right. Yeah. In fact, I'll go ahead. I've got the cover pulled up now, so I'll show it on screen. And of course, I've got to pull up the cover of your book next to White Rural Rage, which is actually hard for me to say, apparently. But that's a prime example of the market that is out there for hating on white individuals, specifically white individuals in rural places like Appalachia. Around the area that I'm from, I'm in Middle Tennessee, so we got a lot of individuals who really fall into the category of white rural rage, and they really are the unprotected class. And in fact, on your book as well, you can see you have the spray painting that says "Kill all." Well, it would say whites, but they forgot the E there. So kill all whits. But really, we unfortunately see these really what individuals would probably classify as a hate crime towards white individuals. So I understand your heart of wanting someone else to write the book, because I sort of felt the same way when I was going to start this podcast. So I totally get where you're coming from there. And when it comes to this book, if you didn't write it, I probably would have had to at some point. So I'm glad that that you were chosen instead of me. So thank you for that. I'm glad that you could take that weight off of my shoulders. But what was the ultimate inspiration? Because obviously you felt the desire to do it, you felt the calling to do it, even if it was kicking and screaming. But what was kind of the last thing to make you kind of snap and realize I've got to take up this mantle?
Yeah, well, and it really was. It did feel like it was a calling to do. I mean, not to be too grandiose about it, but that's how I really felt called in a spiritual sense to do it. And I do actually talk about this even within the church where we've seen some of this. But one of the things that I talk about, as I was thinking about the book, is there are a lot of people who might want to write a book like this, but who are not as fortunately situated as me. I live in Montana. I set my own schedule. I have a very tolerant and supportive employer who has been 100% behind me throughout this book process, for which I'm very thankful. I had a publisher in Regnery, the sort of longest standing conservative publisher, who was very supportive. I had some degree of financial independence and other things. And I just sort of felt like I was in a position where I didn't have an excuse not to write it. I mean, there are a lot of people for whom, sort of taking a risk on a topic like this, it might really, have immediately bad stakes beyond just kind of the back and forth and the reputation and these other things. And I felt like I was in a really good position to talk about this and deal with whatever consequences, positive or negative, came from doing it. And so that's why I decided to do it.
Excellent. Well, glad you did. So where did the anti-white racism really come from? Because of course, America is a majority white country. Obviously, with the open border, that number is going down,
right?
But still we are the majority. So where did this come from? Where would you trace it?
Sure. Well, I mean, and there've been some people who've kind of danced around this, and maybe I don't want to be even uncharitable, because some of them have written terrific books. They've done more than dance around it. My Claremont colleague, Christopher Caldwell, wrote a terrific book on this, civil rights, a few years ago.
Age of Entitlement.
Right. Richard Hanania, who's kind of a little bit of a bomb thrower, but a lot of them, or even Chris Rufo, again, they sort of touch on it, but they kind of use terms like wokeness and things like that. And they're often kind of maybe a little bit reluctant to just call a spade about what's going on here. And I think when you get to the origin, the thing that Caldwell and Hanania, I think, are both very good at is talking about that the origin of this, to some degree, is in civil rights law, and the way that that's been structured, and not just the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but even more the bureaucratic kind of hangings on of that act, some of which went directly against the original act text, but the administrative state sort of took over. And then you had the 1991 Civil Rights Act, which turbocharged the 64 Civil Rights Act and kind of put a whole bunch of other things up into legal jeopardy. So I think that you can't understand this this story completely without talking about civil rights law, which the left has done a very good job of kind of making this sacred thing that we're not allowed to question. At the same time, I think maybe where I dissent, or at least would add a little bit, is I think it's wrong to reduce it to just civil rights law.
Hmm.
I think there are deeper things going on in American society, in the American character, in the kind of noblesse oblige that the white establishment, particularly the white Protestant establishment, has had, the Northeastern establishment that kind of ran things forever in terms of the way that they talked and thought about race, that had nothing to do with any legal requirement per se to do so. I think all those things were really factors beyond just the legal. Or if you look at Hollywood, one of the things I document in my chapter there is just how much, well, obviously there have been ethnic stereotypes of all types and negative portrayals of people of all races, that we've essentially had reverse racism of varying degrees in Hollywood since the 1960s in terms of how people have been portrayed on average in film. And this is not just me sort of speculating or making up things. There are groups, not even necessarily not politically aligned with me at all, in fact, having totally different political agendas, who sort of look at the portrayal of various ethnicities in Hollywood, come to this same conclusion. So I think civil rights law is a big piece of it, but I think that that's not all that's there.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. There's a lot that can be found culture wide. In fact, there's an account on Twitter that I follow, and I believe the name is "White Guys Look Stupid in Commercials" or something to that effect.
Very good.
And it's definitely a account that does it all with humor when they post the different commercials, but they're also they're poking at something that's really true, which is that on just everyday media like a TV commercial, you almost always have the white male that just looks like an absolute idiot, and it's always his wife, who might be white, or she might be a different race altogether, or it's the African American guy, black guy. Again, a cultural. These are the politically correct challenges that we face. Is how do you even talk about these things? And I'm sure you can speak to that in a moment as well. But it's always the non-white male individual that is the smart one that has to clean up after this goofy, dumb white guy. And that tends to be the theme that we've seen all throughout mass media, and it's only ramped up over the last few years. And of course, we had the Google Gemini AI garbage take place, where it was refusing to generate pictures of white men, even white historic men. If you asked them what a average Scottish family looked like, 500 years ago, it was showing a black man as a Scottish man 500 years ago. It's like not too likely. So we have these instances of this institutional anti-white bias taking place. So I mean, you've mentioned that you wouldn't chalk it all up to civil rights. So what other things are you seeing, and where do you think that those things stem from?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned. I mean, it's the Crank Creative is a kind of advertising blog that's looked at a lot of this stuff, and the Twitter account that you mentioned, I actually mentioned in my book, and it does sort of have a lot of this very good kind of information about just how pervasive this type of behavior and stereotyping and whatnot is. I think that again, there are no coincidences here. That doesn't mean that there's conspiracies either, but it just means that there are kind of deep-seated things that are going on in the culture that are causing people to behave in this way. And I think when I look at motivation, I mean, at a micro level, there's kind of a way to look at this of sort of an inner party and an outer party concept. So in political science, I mean, you look at this as the kind of outer party of a movement doesn't necessarily understand what the overall goal of the movement is. And so they just think, well, in going after white people, we're sort of striking a blow for social justice or something of this nature. And then the inner party, which is a much smaller and more select group, understands the strategy more. And again, it doesn't even need to always be conspiratorial. It may not even be fully apparent to themselves what their motivations are, but at least they're a little bit more clued in. And if I have to kind of give the biggest picture thing to sort of jump ahead to the end of my book, I think ultimately at the end of the day, this is about expropriating resources, which we should expect as a um, uh, kind of like basic economics and sociology and everything else. There is one group in society that has traditionally had resources for a variety of reasons, one of which was that, with the exception of African Americans, for a long time, it was the only group in society. It was certainly the only group that made up our political society from
in America, of course.
Yeah, in America, from the time of the Pilgrims through the 1960s. So that was the group that had both developed and largely, again, I'm oversimplifying, but it developed and had all the resources. And there were other groups that wanted those resources. And ultimately, to do that, you're not just going to come in the 21st century and say, like, give up your stuff. You have to have a legitimizing ideology for what you want to do. And so what you want to show ultimately, if you're one of these groups that wants these resources, is that whiteness is evil, that white people have just had a history of oppression, et cetera, et cetera. You have to show that essentially they deserve the very bad things that you are going to try to do to them. And again, I don't want to make this conspiratorial and say that there's some sort of grand plan being there's no protocols of the elders of anti-whiteness kind of going on here. But that's ultimately, I think, at the biggest 50,000 foot level, what drives a lot of this. It's resources and people coming up with ideologies that justify them expropriating resources. And regardless of race, regardless of society, that is a tale that is as old as time and as old as societies in general.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you know, I have my own theory, and I think it can kind of go hand in hand with your conclusion as well. So my theory is that ultimately these individuals hate Christianity. And, you know, I don't necessarily think every single individual knows that that's what they're ultimately fighting against, but ultimately they are fighting against the world that Christianity built. They're ultimately fighting against the Western countries that ultimately produce the most human rights and flourishing imaginable. And coincidentally, although I don't actually believe it's a coincidence, those all happen to be the countries that were massively influenced by Christianity at their founding. Now, not all of them have kept to that, obviously, and America is well on its way to removing those foundations. But ultimately, we were founded as a Christian nation. Whether revisionist historians like to scream and cry that that's not the case. We were founded as a Christian country, and I believe that Christianity naturally brings about wealth and prosperity, because when you're not fighting against God's created order and instead you are aligning yourself with it, you're naturally going to have a lot of positive fruit from that. Now, I'm not preaching a prosperity gospel or anything like that. Obviously, Christ, he promises us hardships, but there's of course hardships, and there's also just the fact that, a prime example. Children are a blessing from the Lord. Psalm 127 says that. Blessed is the man who fills his quiver with them. They're like arrows in the hands of a mighty warrior. So naturally, an individual that is going to have a lot of children is going to have a lot of blessings. That's what the Bible tells us. It's not in a gospel, prosperity gospel kind of way. Having a lot of children, you might have a lot of children and end up like Job, where all your children are crushed. That's the whole book of Job. It completely debunks the prosperity gospel. But either way, this Christianity, Christendom really brought about this prosperity that I think a lot of people end up being jealous of. Envy is one of the deadliest sins. And then, of course, obviously, we believe that there is an enemy who ultimately hates the seed of Adam, and he ultimately wants to see Christ's influence on earth destroyed. And obviously, he knows that he's going to lose, but he's going to do what he can to bring as many people to hell with him. And I think that that's ultimately where he's the father of lies, and these lies take place, and they form into their own ideologies like Marxism and communism and all the isms. And ultimately, they're warring against God's design, and they're warring against Christianity. And we don't know why. We really don't know why, but for some reason, history lends it in a way where God willed it that majority white nations happen to be the ones that inherited the Christian tradition. I think if Christianity took root in Asia, we'd have Asian supremacy going on right now. And obviously there's some of that as well on the fringes, but that would be the mass problem that you and I are talking about on
Sure.
today's podcast. And that's my ultimate theory. So I know that was a whole lot, but feel free to respond to any of that.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned it. I think that there's a lot to what you say, and I'd also kind of flip it on its head a little bit, because I think that in many ways Christianity is implicated in the following way as well, which is that so many of these isms that you touch on are a result of the death of Christianity in our society. And this notion that they haven't actually, I mean, Chesterton has this kind of great quote that, roughly paraphrased, is sort of like, you're not gonna you sort of can't chase out God. You're just gonna to put like something else in that religious place. I'm really paraphrasing now. Yeah, says it in a much more elegant way, but you're going to worship something basically.
Yeah.
And so we have decided as a society to not worship God, and therefore a whole bunch of other things have kind of had to come in to give people's lives meaning since the kind of Nietzschean death of God. And by that I don't mean, of course, that literally God is dead, but that modernity, through people like Nietzsche and Marx and Freud, etc., has kind of come to not have that sort of close relationship with God that we've always had throughout Christendom and throughout the Western tradition. And that so much of what you see is a consequence of that. And then also, as you point out, the seven deadly sins. And for me, the deadliest of those, this is not a theological perspective, this is just my personal view, is envy. And it's the most tempting one, I think, for a lot of people. And so I think that all those things are very much in play when we talk about this type of issue.
Yeah, and ultimately, envy has been rebranded as social justice now, and so
Yes, absolutely.
that's I believe it was Thomas Sowell who said that, and yeah, that's unfortunately true. And to your point, I agree with you that it's the loss of Christianity that's kind of leading to this degradation that we see in our culture now. But also coincidentally, it seems, statistically speaking, white Americans tend to be the most biblically religious individuals in the land. So I think that that's kind of, again, leading to some of this white racism in a roundabout way. I don't think most individuals are, discriminated against white individuals because they're Christian. But of course, we do see this with things like intersectionality. It's always the, who's the most privileged? It's white,
Right.
able-bodied, male, Christian. Christian's
of
always
course.
thrown in there at some point or another if you dig deep enough. So for some reason, it's just Christianity has a target on its back, and
Right.
it shows up in this anti-white racism.
And of course, we have a tradition within Christianity of turning the other cheek, going back to the gospel. And I mean, these are actually very powerful. And again, the Nietzscheans always incorrectly, in my view, sort of rebel against this, that the weakness of Christ was ultimately his great strength. And this is, I think, a really important element of Christianity. But there's also a devil's snare that's very close to this, that I think, unfortunately, even a lot of churches have kind of fallen prey to, where you take this very appropriate humility, understanding of your own sin, et cetera, that is really important, understanding the faults of, white America kind of writ large historically, and sins, of which there were many. And I'm not trying to erase history and claim that those didn't exist. But then you kind of go from there, and you ultimately are too scared to, as a white person, be for yourself or to stand up for yourself. And you kind of say, well, I'm actually just sort of following the gospel in abasing myself in that way. But we're actually supposed to pursue justice, not simply abase ourselves infinitely to no end, even when that's not justified. And so I think there is this very powerful and good strain of Christianity that is saying we need to be very aware of our own sin. But then there's, I think, sometimes on particularly the white Christian establishment, even most particularly in the mainline church, and I talk about this a lot in my book, where this kind of disintegrates into kind of a really pathetic form of racial self-flagellation.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, I wrote an article saying something a little bit similar that I think kind of pairs well with this. So I was just going to read a section from that article. I said, don't get me wrong, the discrimination we face today, we being white individuals, is not nearly as bad as it was for Black Americans in decades prior. In fact, I believe it is because of this fact that white Americans are unwilling to call out the discrimination being acted out against them in the year of 2024. We feel like we are being dramatic or not sympathetic to the plights of the previous generations of Black Americans. However, I think the case can be made that the discrimination against white Americans will only get worse if we do not name it and speak against it now. So feel free to respond to that.
Agree completely. And again, I mean, there are reasons both legitimate and illegitimate to talk about historical wrongs of racism that have happened within society that white people were perpetrators of rather than victims. But that ultimately, if we don't simply insist on a gospel, and I'm not using that term in a religious sense, but in a secular sense, of equality, and again, I don't mean equality in the sense of equality of outcomes, but that we are going to treat people equally regardless of backgrounds in this country.
Egalitarianism, yeah.
Yeah, it's not going to be a going concern. I mean, the history, and I talk about this a lot in the book, of multicultural nations where you have institutionalized discrimination from one group or another. It's just not pretty, and it tends to end in violence. And really, the only way we can go around this and get around this is to really focus on building a unified American identity. And the only way that we can do that, well, besides, I would say, really getting control of our borders so that we have time to kind of recohere as a society.
Yeah.
But then I think the second way that we do that is we just have to completely insist on no discrimination, regardless of who's perpetrating it.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's the principle that Martin Luther, MLK is known for, of course, is the content of someone's character. And MLK is a mixed bag, and I've talked about him previously. I think that he's known for that one great idea, but I don't even know if that idea came from him, honestly. But that's a whole other can of worms that we can't get into today.
For sure.
I want to talk a lot more about those solutions that you began alluding to. But before we do that, I'm sure someone at some point is going to be listening to this episode and say, well, you guys haven't actually brought up some real tangible examples. So can you give us some tangible examples beyond, white guys acting silly in commercials of this anti-white bias in our society?
Sure. Well, the first thing I'd say, of course, is buy the book, which will be out in April, and you'll be filled with almost 1,000 citations of specific examples of all sorts. But I look at everything from the way that history is being erased. So statues coming down of people like George Washington, even the way at which there are explicit, effectively racial quotas being put in that are never marketed as against white people, but for other groups, which of course excludes white people. So functionally the same thing. And we see this in education. We see this in employment. We see certain things even in the way that crime is covered. So George Floyd and the kind of sanctification of George Floyd, this career criminal. And again, I'm sure that there are folks in your audience who have a variety of different views about how that trial and whether any justice was served there or not. But I think we can certainly say that this kind of anti-police, police brutality kind of narrative is in fact really the opposite of the truth, that in fact whites are overwhelmingly disproportionately the victims of interracial crimes rather than the perpetrators of racial crimes. That could go on and on. I have a historical chapter, or it's not entirely historical, but I go through a lot of historical things about white flight from cities, from the middle and working classes in the 1950s. And it's really a case that's one of the only times I'm aware of in history where a group that was effectively ethnically cleansed from its traditional neighborhoods and communities was turned around and blamed for being ethnically cleansed. And, I kind of show within the book that there's this very false history that we've been taught of, there were just these terrible racist white people that as soon as minorities moved into their neighborhood, they just fled. And what I really show and document throughout the chapter is that that is somewhere between a gross oversimplification or an overt lie, depending on the kind of situation in which you're talking about. So that would be a few, but then I talk about it within the church, and we've addressed this a little bit. There is huge active discrimination going on in the military, business community, you name it. So I have about 11 different subject chapters covering pretty much 90% of the types of human endeavor, and I kind of document anti-white racism and discrimination within each of them.
Yeah, and ultimately, I think white individuals, and of course, I am one. So that we have this struggle where you can't get out of the game, but you also can't win the game. There's nothing for you. There's no scenario where you come out as a winner.
Right.
If you move into an all black neighborhood as a white person, that's gentrification, and
Right.
you're trying to force your white culture into this black neighborhood. But then at the same time, if you leave and then that's white flight, and you're intentionally
Yeah.
doing that so you can make the market crash. And ultimately, there's so many instances where the white man literally it cannot win. There is a lose-lose situation before them at all points. I mean, a prime example: we're supposed to tell everyone how we repent for our racism, but then at the same time, we've constantly been told by black scholars in this area, many of which I would just classify as black grifters, that it will never be enough, no matter how much we apologize for. And then they'll ask for reparations in states like California, and they'll ask for $1 million, and then they might get some movement towards getting that first million, and then they say that's not enough, we need $1 billion, and then
Right.
it goes up to $1 trillion. At the end of the day, there is no winning for the white person in America, and I think that white individuals are beginning to sense that now. I think
Yeah.
2020 was sort of the height of everyone wanting to fall on their face and apologize. But I think 4 years later, so many individuals are seeing, wait a second, like we said that we'd look into getting you reparations, and it's not enough for you. You want more. You always want more. You always want more, no matter what we do, no matter what kind of demands we try to meet, no matter how many times we post the black square, no matter if we have BLM on our businesses, you still burnt it to the ground. So at the end of the day, I think that many white individuals are beginning to give up on that, which is a positive and a negative. It's a positive because so many people are starting to free themselves from feeling guilty. I myself am one of them. I'm naturally not a confrontational person. I exercise my muscle of confrontation all the time, but ultimately, I'm an easygoing guy, and so I'm totally willing to just capitulate and be like, yeah, like my ancestors did do some messed up stuff. I'm real sorry about that. But then it's getting to a point where it's like, you know what? Actually, I don't want to apologize for my ancestors because I'm not them, and
Right.
I think that's a positive development. But on the flip side, I really think that there's a group of white individuals now that are starting to genuinely become racist because they're
Yeah.
reaching to a point where it's like, I'm being blamed for everything. Oliver Anthony's song went so viral because so many white individuals, especially in rural places, really identify with like, yeah, I'm just like working all day, selling my soul, and I'm among the statistic that's the most likely to kill themselves via suicide. And so we're reaching a point where there's these individuals that are like, I'm being blamed all the time for society's problems. So you know what? Yeah, I'm going to start actually, feeding into these race narratives. And that's a whole other thing. I believe that the media is also trying to create a race war. I think that they constantly show, black individuals robbing stores in San Francisco all the time to make the white man in Oklahoma really mad. And I think that they try to show the one instance that they can find out of a million of a white person being maybe minorly racist, and they try to blow that up into something bigger than it is to make the black Americans mad. And I really think that they're just trying to stoke the flames and get us into a race war. So with that, let's kind of pivot to some of the solutions. Do you see that with the race war, and what kind of things do you think are going to start to maybe turn down the temperature?
Well, I do think it's a big risk, and how overt that war might get, or how hot versus cold it might get. I think still to be determined, but it's a real problem. The media absolutely is one of the major amplifiers of this as a problem. I do agree that the discourse around this has gotten much freer. When I started writing this book a couple years ago, I felt like, wow, I'm really going over some of this stuff without a net. And now I feel like the mainstream, to a degree, I mean, this is still definitely a book that will be a provocative book, but it has come to me. There are other people not as many as I'd like, but some who are kind of coming out and saying some of these things
Right.
in the mainstream. And I think that's important. At the same time, I ultimately view it, and the way I justified writing this book is I think it is ultimately, we either have a choice between this and a variety of ethnic racial nationalism, whether that be from blacks, from whites, from Asians. So this is really an attempt to turn down the temperature ultimately, to have some confrontation that is going to be somewhat unpleasant for people around these issues now, where we come to a reality, and kind of deal with each other on a basis of reality and on a basis of equal treatment and equal citizenship. Because if we don't do that, it is going to continue to fire up a justified, ultimately, sense of grievance on the part of many white people, and then that could lead into some really non-productive solutions for everyone. And I ultimately wrote this, certainly primarily with a white audience in mind, but in no way exclusively. And I say that quite explicitly because I think ultimately we have to, of all races and backgrounds, have some agreement about what the rules of the road, what the rules of engagement are going to be, in society as we're going forward. And if we don't do that, I think it's going to be a problem. To answer the second part of your question, specific solutions. So one of the things I talk about a little bit, I kind of talk about white shifting, and this is a kind of notion. So there are some solutions I have that are kind of very broad. They're not kind of, oh, this is a specific policy thing. It's more of a broad cultural thing. Secondly, I've got some specific policy solutions. The specific policy solutions are more things like net zero immigration, getting rid of affirmative action, totally revisiting in some very fundamental ways civil rights law, things like that. Then I've got these sort of more complex things, which sometimes would go by scholars in terms of what we call ethnogenesis. So essentially recreating an American ethnicity, if you will, or as Philip Kaufman, who's a multiracial scholar of race, in America and elsewhere, has called it, white shifting. So the notion that he, who is a person of Asian and Hispanic and white background, but he kind of identifies culturally with the white majority in history, primarily of the country. That's called kind of where I think we need to do it. I think really, particularly Hispanics, are an obvious kind of place that I think we could start here, where if we got rid of the benefits for folks to identify themselves differently on that basis, which we didn't have. We didn't have Hispanic as a census category until 1980. But you're already seeing in many ways that these third generation Hispanics who are supporting Trump in very significant numbers, they kind of are, they're culturally like white Americans in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And if we take away the kind of legal and cultural benefits of identifying themselves as something else, then maybe you kind of build a united community around a shared history, and you can go back, and there is Hispanic. I was just actually in San Antonio, right, where there is Hispanic settlement in what is now the U.S. going back to the times of the Pilgrims, if not even before. So we can tell this type of much more unified story. But you could do the same thing for Eurasians and all sorts of other groups as we begin to have it more intermarriage. And I think we can kind of recohere around that American identity if we take away the legal incentives for not identifying as white, and we close the border so that we're not kind of making our ethnic problems be even more severe by having an even more polarized multi-ethnic state.
Right. And of course, there's going to be individuals that feign racism for what you just said, because why wouldn't you want to have a diverse group of individuals coming in, and ultimately what we're talking about is culture. It's really not race. What we're talking about is we can't have individuals from China and from Indonesia, from Guatemala, and from everywhere in the world all coming in and showing up at the same train station and expecting that train station to have a cohesive understanding of the rules of the road. That's just not how it works. Many of these individuals don't even speak English, and obviously we have a lot of Spanish speakers in America now. But even so, those are just two languages of hundreds and hundreds of languages that we could see representative in America. So how can we communicate with one another? We don't have that cohesion. So I just thought I'd throw that quick tidbit out there because I know someone and somewhere is going to be very upset with what you're saying. But they sound like very common sense solutions. So what do you think actually needs to take place to get some of those solutions to actually happen? Because as a white man, I have white children, and I'm honestly scared for their future. I truly do believe, like I read earlier from my previous article, that I think that this discrimination will only get worse if it's not called out and properly mitigated. So what do you think needs to happen?
Well, I have 5 kids. I mean, that's why I wrote it too. I mean, I'm older. Things are fine for me. I can manage. I mean, there are disabilities that are out there, but there's nothing that I can't kind of handle. But when I look at my kids' generation, it's a much different story for them. Um, I think basically what we have to move to, and again, it's something I talk about in the book, is a concept of what kind of kept peace in the Cold War, except that it's less risky even than what worked for the Cold War, of mutually assured destruction. And that always kept us from having a nuclear first strike, because we knew if we did that, it was sort of the end for both of us. I think we need to do that around racism, anti-white racism in this country, where the left needs to understand that if they engage in this, the political and social and cultural blowback to them is going to be so severe that they simply decide, whoa, maybe we should just, try something different here. Maybe we don't want to go down this road. So part of this, to be crass, will be really helped by a Republican electoral win in 2024, regardless of all the frustrations that I certainly have of the GOP. But the GOP is at least tepid defenders of kind of colorblind society, or at least opposing anti-white racism. At least there's some. Whereas the Democratic Party is really actively pushing this every day from the president on down. So I don't think there's any way that we can kind of do this without kind of that type of political victory. And actually, the interesting sort of thing, it's kind of one of these ironies, is that Trump, for all of his alleged white supremacy or racial provocation that you would hear about from his opponents, actually, if you believe the polls, has the smallest racial gap that we've probably ever seen in terms of his support between white and minority supporters. And I think to the extent that we could interpret a Trump victory in 2024 as a really multicultural statement of pro-Americanism that was really against anti-whiteness, that is for closing the border, for all those things, that would be an enormously helpful development. So ultimately, I think there's no substitute for political victory. There's no substitute for judicial victory. And I think we have some opportunities in the Supreme Court to undo some of the worst things that the administrative state has done on race. And then I think we need to change the incentives around civil rights laws. And I think that's another really important piece of it. I think there's a lot of people who would come out as allies if they didn't feel like, if I don't discriminate against white individuals, I might be in line for millions of dollars of fines. So I think there's huge opportunities to do things like that.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on all that. I think the concern is it's a heavy lift, unfortunately, with today's America. I've been circling that same drain though about mutually assured destruction, and that's been my internal struggle is not wanting to identify as a white male all the time, but also recognizing that, like, for one reason or another, it's guys that look like me that are getting shafted constantly. And of course, I personally am doing okay. But I do know many individuals who have applied to colleges, and they were overlooked, even though they had amazing grades by someone with worse academics than them, but just a different skin tone. And I have instances like that. In fact, actually, I believe it was the one of the Tennessee Baptist organizations, I can't remember which, but they were specifically talking about wanting to nominate individuals to be sort of on a board that would represent Tennessee Baptists. And on this board, they specifically said they're looking for people who will add to their diversity with their race or sex. And it's
Right.
like, this is a Baptist organization telling people you can nominate whoever you want, but you're going to be more likely to get it if you happen to be black
Right.
or female. And it's just like, it's just intersectionality within a Baptist organization. I mean, it's disgusting. So,
Sure.
I've been circling that same drain of mutually assured destruction. So I know we're coming close to our time here, but what does that look like?
Sure.
I mean, how can we actually do that in a way that's not gonna escalate the issue and make it into, God forbid, a hot war between races
Right.
in America? But how can we do that in a way that's actually going to de-escalate long term, even if things get a little dicey for a brief moment?
Sure. And I should add one thing that I sort of struggle with here is white people, understandably, even more than most. I think the only critique I almost paid attention to that I got in talking to people at the book before I wrote it was, oh, we don't want to have a victim mentality. And this is not the
Yeah,
goal of my book, is for like white people to be like, oh, I'm the victim. We actually are doing quite well still, because we still have a lot of cultural capital and other things in our community that we've, again, I'm speaking really grossly, right? Because the white community is very big and diverse in and of
right.
itself. But we have a lot of cultural capital and a lot of things that are still going well. What I'm just trying to do is like, let's call out reality, okay? Without sort of saying like, oh, we're the victim. It's just that to say, look, if we want to make any progress toward justice, we need to do so on the basis of reality, because what a mutually assured destruction could look like is essentially what you were just hinting at. I mean, it could be like actual hot civil conflict in a place where there's several hundred million firearms in private ownership,
Yeah,
um, or it could be just gross expropriation that becomes very direct, like reparations that you're beginning to see talked about. I mean, we already have a lot of indirect things that functionally serve
right.
as reparations, but um, it could get very ugly. And just to really educate people about the way that multi-ethnic societies have broken down in very ugly ways, and to really say the only way around this is if we're going to treat people with equal justice under the law.
Yeah,
And that means you got to stop discriminating against white people. And that means that maybe not all the outcomes of every single test or event or whatever are going to be equally distributed by race or
right.
everything else. And we have to be comfortable with that. And I am, and I'm encouraging other people to do that, because the alternative, even if this doesn't feel perfect to people, is going to be so much worse.
Mm, yeah. I completely agree. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about that. I'm definitely going to have to pick up a copy of your book, and I definitely would encourage my audience to do so as well. And give it to your pastor, give it to your boss, give it to these individuals who have, influence. Honestly, because I think that that's going to be a big key, as well as just influencing these individuals, changing their minds, and letting their greater influence than maybe what you have make an impact as well. So, Jeremy, where
Yeah.
can people actually find the book?
Yeah, so you can pre-order it right now on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever you want online. Again, it'll be out April 23rd officially. So if you pre-order it now, it'll show up on your house on that day, which is not that long from now at this point. So that's the easiest thing to do, and I really do encourage people to do it. Not because it's going to go make me a bunch of money. Anybody who knows the way that authorship and books work, it's not exactly a road to riches, but because
No.
it in selling these sorts of things, it gives publishers the kind of signal that, hey, there's a real audience out there for people who care about these issues, and that we should go seek out more people with interesting ideas here. And I think that it's really important to get more of those
Yeah.
ideas into the public square. I'd say beyond that, you can follow me on Twitter, or X rather. Real Jeremy Carl is my handle there. Or I have a new Substack called The Course of Empire. Jeremy Carl, my name, .substack.com. You can find my writing there on a regular basis as well as any number of publications that I write for pretty regularly, and I pretty much always feature those on X as well. But would love folks to go out, buy the book, and really appreciate the opportunity to be on your show.
Awesome. Well, thanks again, Jeremy. And thank you, listener. Feel free to go to our Substack, Forge and Anvil.substack.com. You can sign up for free with your email to get free content. There's a lot of that. And then, of course, you can also become a paid supporter and get additional content as well, directly from yours truly and others. So feel free to go to Forge and Anvil.substack.com. We appreciate your support. And thank you again, Jeremy, for joining us. And thank you all for listening. We will see you next time.